There are a lot of Pokemon. Like, there's 1,000 of these things, and as a result, Game Freak has had to get creative to make them stand out. Sometimes this comes about with super funky designs, like this guy. What is this thing? Other times, it's through interesting game mechanics, like Palafin changing into a superhero when you switch it out, or a piece of sushi piloting a catfish like it's some kind of big blue mech. And I'm glad they're doing this. Branching out and exploring new design space is a good thing. It's the only way that they've been able to keep Pokemon around for as long as it has been, and I want them to keep it up. But the more experimental these designs get, the more dangerous they become. That's the idea I want to talk about today, but first, we need to lay some groundwork. Dondozo and Tatsugiri, the big catfish and mimicry Pokemon, may be the most unique Pokemon designs, mechanically speaking, to ever exist. Tatsugiri's ability, Commander, only works in double battles. Essentially, when both it and Dondozo are on the field, Tatsugiri jumps into Dondozo's mouth, entering a semi-impervious state where it cannot be targeted, cannot be affected by moves, and cannot use attacks, and both it and Dondozo cannot leave the field by any means. It can still be affected by a few niche things, like if it got statused or heard Perish Song before it went into Dondozo's mouth, but we can talk about that if it comes up. In exchange for essentially turning off one of your Pokemon, Dondozo gets a 2-stage boost to each stat, essentially doubling its stats from its unboosted form. This is insanely powerful. The ability to easily get 2 Omni boosts on a Pokemon is so desirable that people were literally willing to play Eevee to make it happen back to Generation 7, using a setup that required you to build your entire team around it and took 2 turns before you were able to actually take advantage of the boosts. With Dondozo and Tatsugiri, you don't have to run any crazy setup turns or any 325 base stat Pokemon. You get to run 2 relatively powerful Pokemon that you're happy enough to have on the field even without their gimmick. Alright, so that Omni boost is pretty damn strong, but there's plenty of counterplay here, isn't there? What's the big deal? Can't you just match the boosts yourself with Setup or Intimidate down the Dondozo once they get their boosts up? Well, not quite. We've talked about Tatsugiri's ability, but not Dondozo's. Dondozo has 2 abilities that we've seen it swap between over the course of Scarlet and Violet. Oblivious, which makes it immune to Intimidate, and a few other moves like Taunt and Encore, and Unaware, which makes it ignore your opponent's stat changes. Whether they're at +6 attack or -6, they'll be treated as having no boosts or decreases when attacking Dondozo. And Dondozo will similarly ignore their defensive changes while it's attacking. So, if your plan to beat Dondozo involves intimidating it or setting up with your own Pokemon like Swords Dance King Gambit, you're going to have to accept that some percentage of the time, the opponent's Dondozo's ability is going to invalidate your plan. So you may need something that handles Dondozo a little more directly. 2 moves come to mind there, Haze and Clear Smog. Haze removes all stat changes on the field, and Clear Smog removes all stat changes on the target, if it connects. Haze is pretty set and forget. Click the button, and Dondozo's boosts are gone. Clear Smog, you need to make sure that the move actually connects, so stuff like Substitute, Protect, or Terra Steel, to make Dondozo immune to Clear Smog, can stymie your plans. There is a 5th secret way to beat Dondozo as well. Just use Pokemon with insanely broken stats, like Fluttermane and Chinpow, that could just outdamage its huge defensive bulk. That last answer, overpowering Dondozo, only is really viable when we get farther into a game's life cycle and powerful legendary or sub-legendary Pokemon are introduced into the game. And even then, only specific combinations of Pokemon, in specific conditions, can power through Dondozo like he's a regular Pokemon. Without one of the answers we've discussed, Dondozo allows its trainer to create an extremely powerful scenario, where both players have 2 Pokemon worth of stats on the field, but the Dondozo player is only actually exposing 1 Pokemon. This has a bunch of advantages. First, because you're interacting with only one of the Dondozo player's Pokemon at a time, Dondozo's moves like Substitute and Protect become even better at allowing the Dondozo player to control the pace of the game, allowing them to bring it to a crawl. This is especially powerful with passive healing effects like Leftovers or Grassy Terrain, or damage over time effects like Poison. Second, as we alluded to before, because Dondozo lets you use 2 Pokemon worth of stats while only exposing one of your Pokemon, it's incredibly effective at damage trading. You can either take out Pokemon all at once with Wave Crash, or spread out damage over your opponent's entire team with powerful +2 Earthquakes, allowing the rest of your team to pick up knockouts on your opponent's weakened team once they finally beat the Dondozo. Meanwhile, while you're doing that, all of your opponent's damage has to be pinpointed into one place, just Dondozo. The point here is, without some kind of dedicated counterplay, it is extremely difficult to play fairly into Dondozo. You need to build your team to respect Dondozo. And, for the reasons we're about to discuss, that's actually a bad thing. First, an example from, Magic the Gathering. In Magic the Gathering, there's a deck archetype called Dredge. That deck plays the game on a completely different axis than other decks, and because of that, decks that are trying to play a normal game, or quote-unquote play fair, have to play hyper-specific cards that interact with Dredge so they can beat it, but often those cards didn't offer very much value in other matchups. This created a vicious cycle. Dredge would do very well because people didn't play the anti-Dredge cards. People would play the counter cards to beat Dredge, and suddenly Dredge would be bad. Then, one or two people would play their decks without the counter cards, assuming everybody else would do the due diligence for them. And, because they were right, one of them would win the tournament. From there, more people would start to take their Dredge cards out of their decks again to try to make it beat whatever won, and whoops, Dredge would win again, starting the cycle all over again. This is exactly what Dondozo does. And it's a pretty unique situation for Pokemon. Now, you might be saying, hold on, Scraw. People play specific things to beat other individual Pokemon all the time. For example, probably the most common individual Pokemon people try to beat in team building, specifically, is Amoonguss. And sure, sometimes they'll take the form of an item like Safety Goggles, which has very little utility in most metagames outside of beating Pokemon like Amoonguss, but Safety Goggles is the exception rather than the rule. Many people try to beat Amoonguss with moves like Taunt, or Pokemon that are immune to one or both of its super scary moves, Spore and Rage Powder, like one of the Ogerpons, Rillaboom, or Goldengo. But here's the thing, neither Taunt nor any of these Pokemon are only good at beating Amoonguss. They're tools that help you beat it, sure, but you could play your tournament without ever seeing an Amoonguss and still feel like each and every one of these Pokemon were an invaluable member of your team. Compare that to the way you have to play to beat Dondozo. Assume we're in a lower power level regional dex format, where the tools dictate you need a hard answer, like Clear Smog or Haze. You're losing a lot of value in other matchups by being forced to run these tools. For example, Amoonguss is the most common Clear Smog user, and to fit Clear Smog on an Amoonguss, you need to drop a move like Protect, which completely changes the way you have to navigate positioning your Amoonguss. And sure, you can get a little value out of Clear Smog by clearing things like Swords Dance, or maybe even an Intimidate drop on your own Pokemon if you want to get creative. In literally every matchup except Dondozo, you would prefer to have Protect over Clear Smog on your Amoonguss. Haze, the other move, would often be run on Pokemon like Palafin or Chinpow, both Pokemon that really want as many options as possible to deal huge damage. Instead of getting to run a move like Close Combat or Ice Punch, Palafin would get stuck with no coverage except water because it needed room for Haze and Protect. And Chinpow would be in a similar situation, not being able to run Sacred Sword, making it significantly worse against another common threat, King Gambit, and having to choose between whether it wanted a priority move in Sucker Punch or a non-priority Dark-type stab like Crunch. Again, both Pokemon become exponentially stronger in literally every other matchup if they didn't have to run a move to respect Dondozo. Now, another point you might make is that there have been teams that operate on weird angles in the past, ones that you might consider quote-unquote unfair, like the Chansey Shuckle teams, that would set up a +6 evasion Chansey with an insane defense stat using Guard Split. But there's a difference here. This combination came about in the wild, by which I mean it just so happened that two Pokemon had synergies that players discovered themselves and built around. This is unlike Dondozo and Tatsugiri, because to fix a combo like Chansey and Shuckle, Game Freak could simply remove one key move between the generations, or just not include these two Pokemon in the same Pokedex without losing anything. Dondozo and Tatsugiri have their synergy baked into the Pokemon's design. You could not remove this synergy without fundamentally destroying the premise the Pokemon is based on, and because of that, it is significantly more likely that they wouldn't make that kind of change, and they shouldn't. And so, since they cannot remove this synergy, they need to be aware of it. From now until the end of Pokemon, in lower power level regional dex formats, if Game Freak wants to include Dondozo and Tatsugiri in a new game's Pokedex, they'll have only a few options. 1. Include Pokemon that can afford to waste one of their move slots on a purely anti-Dondozo move, the way Palafin and Chinpow can with Haze and Amoonguss could with Clear Smog. 2. Take the risk that people will eventually find a more natural out to Dondozo and potentially destroy the metagame if a good counterplay is not found. 3. And I think this is the worst option, simply never include Dondozo and Tatsugiri in a regional Pokedex again, save them for the DLC. I've been negative, but these kinds of designs are good, and it's a good thing that Game Freak is experimenting. They just need to make sure that the new design spaces they explore expand Pokemon and don't accidentally restrict them in the future. Let me know what you think in the comments, and hopefully you want me to do more of these. Thanks, bye.